Hello, welcome to our webinar entitled Climate Justice, Indigenous Justice. I'm your host, Carla Stoltzfus-Detweiler, Climate Justice Coordinator for Mennonite Church USA. This webinar is the first in a four-part series on climate justice as part of our Learn, Pray, Join Climate Justice Seeking Shalom initiative. Today, I am joined by four guests who offer a wealth of wisdom for us to learn from on our journey of seeking justice and wholeness for our climate and for our planet. We welcome Sarah Augustine, Executive Director and co-founder of the Coalition to Dismantle the Doctrine of Discovery, and Sherry Hostetler, Mennonite pastor and also co-founder of the Coalition to Dismantle the Doctrine of Discovery. Sarah and Sherry recently co-authored the book, So We and Our Children May Live, Following Jesus in Dismantling the Doctrine of Discovery, in confronting the climate crisis, excuse me. There's a lot about dismantling the doctrine of discovery too. And this book was recently published by Herald Press and has been inviting readers to wrestle deeply with the roots of the climate crisis. So welcome, Sarah and Sherry. We also welcome Manuel Me Castillo. Manuel is a Maya Indigenous scholar from the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico. Manuel has had a steady presence at the United Nations forums on Indigenous issues. His current area of research focuses on the role of Indigenous delegates and representatives in the production of knowledge and norms on the UN level. Welcome, Manuel. And we welcome Mark Charles. Mark is the son of an American woman of Dutch heritage and a Navajo man. Mark teaches with insight into the complexities of American history regarding race, culture, and faith in order to help forge a path of healing and conciliation for our nation. Mark is also co-author of a book entitled Unsettling Truths, the ongoing dehumanizing legacy of the doctrine of discovery. And that book was published by InterVarsity Press in 2019. Welcome, Mark. Thank you for joining us. And we are also joined by Lorraine Stutzman-Amstutz, Mennonite Church USA's denominational minister for peace and justice. Thank you for joining us, Lorraine. And thank you to all of you who are participating in the webinar today. We are beginning our Climate Justice Seeking Shalom series by recognizing the interconnectedness of justice for our climate and justice for Indigenous peoples. As Sarah and Sherry articulate so clearly in their book, in the United States and around the world, colonial practices of extraction and exploitation have led to the devastation both of our climate and of the lives and lifeways of Indigenous peoples. Healing and repair for both Indigenous peoples and for our climate require a departure from those colonial injustices in pursuit of systemic changes that support all of life. So thanks to you all for joining us as we consider how we might join in the transformation that is required for healing to happen. The gathering is in webinar format, so all attendees are muted and the chat is disabled. We will, however, be posting some links in the chat. Spanish interpretation is available. Just click the interpretation globe at the bottom of your screen. We welcome your questions, and we'll try to get to as many as we can at the end. Feel free to use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Only the panelists will be able to see your questions. We will also answer some of your pre-submitted questions as time allows at the end of the webinar. Lorraine, will you please open us in prayer?
Yes, thanks, Carla. I'm happy to be here with you all. My role is I will open us in prayer. I will also help to monitor the questions that come in to ask our panelists near the end. But join me in prayer. God, we ask that you grant us the wisdom, the strength and courage to care for creation as you intended. Help us all to recognize our interconnectedness with all that is living and being on this earth, and to act with compassion and justice in the face of this climate crisis. Continue to guide us in our efforts to protect the earth and its vulnerable communities from harm, and inspire us to continue to do the work for climate justice. Amen.
Thank you, Lorraine. Let's dive in with some questions for our panelists. And the first one, Sarah and Sherry, is directed to you. In your book, you assert that the climate crisis is a symptom of a deeper crisis. What is the deeper crisis?
Well, thanks, Carla. I think I'm going to be fielding this one. So we say in our book that ecological overshoot, not climate change, is the real problem. And ecological overshoot is when our demands on the planet are greater than what Earth's ecosystems can renew. It's when we consume and pollute the Earth faster than it can regenerate itself. And I want to show you two graphics that illustrate ecological overshoot. Changed my worldview and really made me realize that climate change is only a symptom of this deeper crisis of ecological overshoot. So let me show you this first graphic. So this hopefully looks like a bunch of hockey sticks. So we are living in a time unique in human existence, starting at about 1950, which is the blue line running through all of these graphics. Starting in the 1950s, human economic activity accelerated really sharply, which is why they call it a hockey stick. That's when the stick starts going up. So charts showing the rise in gross domestic product, which you can see there on the top row, second from the left. From the 1750s onwards show this hockey stick, but it's not just GDP that follows this hockey stick pattern. So does world population, carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere, ocean acidification, water use, damming of rivers, biodiversity loss, fertilizer consumption, and even the use of even McDonald's restaurants. And so because of this hockey stick pattern, economists call this time since the 1950s the Great Acceleration. And the Great Acceleration reflects the transformation of practically the entire globe into a Western industrial consumer society. More goods and services have been produced and consumed from 1950 to 2000 than in all human history to that date. And I'm going to repeat that because it's such an astounding fact. More goods and services have been produced and consumed from 1950 to 2000 than in all human history to that date. Now, this great acceleration benefited sort of white settler middle-class families like my own, at least in the short term. But now no place is immune from the problems created by an economic system demanding perpetual growth. And in our book, we link the economic system of perpetual growth to the logic of colonization. And while those who have been uncolonized, indigenous communities, those enslaved during the African slave trade and their descendants, and people in the global South, while these folks have suffered the most, we say colonization is coming for all of us, including those who have previously benefited from it. Now, I want to also show you another graphic, another one that really, to my mind, illustrates this issue of ecological overshoot. And here it is. So for 12,000 years, humans have operated within a delicately balanced Earth system that maintains our atmosphere and our oceans and ecosystems. So in the mid-2000s, an international interdisciplinary team of scientists gathered in Stockholm to define the safe operating space for humanity. And they found 9 key processes that threaten the stability of this delicately balanced Earth system. And I'm going to go through these quickly, but hopefully clearly. It starts there on the top with climate change, carbon dioxide emissions, we know about that. To the left, biosphere loss, loss of biodiversity, land system change, which refers particularly to the conversion of tropical forests to farmland. Freshwater use, we're using a lot of water. Biogeochemical flows of nitrogen and phosphorus. That just refers to the kinds of fertilizers and chemicals used in industrial agriculture. Ocean acidification, atmospheric aerosol pollution, depletion of the ozone layer, and then what they call novel entities here, which refers to environmental pollutants like heavy metals and radioactive materials and plastics and industrial chemicals. So what this chart shows is that we've already overshot the safe operating space on 6 of those 9 boundaries. And exceeding climate change and biodiversity limits is especially worrisome to scientists because they consider those to be core planetary boundaries that they said on their own could destabilize this system. But one scientist involved with this study said this, and this is a scary quote. So I hope it's just the reality though. What we don't know is how long we can keep pushing these key planetary boundaries before combined pressures lead to irreversible change and harm. Think of humanity blindfolded, simultaneously walking toward 9 cliff edges, and you gain some sense of the seriousness and urgency of our situation. Deep breaths.
Yeah, thank you, Sherry, for helping us imagine and understand ecological overshoot as the deeper source of our climate crisis. And now I'm wondering if you can help us, and Sarah, maybe you'll help us to make the connections then with this climate crisis and justice for Indigenous peoples. How are those two, how do they go hand in hand?
You bet. So the first thing I want to do is reframe this question and talk about colonization. Everything that we're experiencing now is as a result of colonization. Colonization is this process where one group of people believe they have the right to come in, invade other nations around the world, and completely consume the resources there for profit. That is the process of colonization. And specifically, settler colonialism is when one culture comes in, smushes itself over the top of another, and pretends that culture no longer exists. This is the process of colonization. And colonization is it's rooted in a logic of extraction, extractive logic. This idea that the world, nature, is a playground for us to exploit with no impact. And that logic, that thought experiment is the thing that is driving ecological overshoot and, in fact, climate change. So you could say from the beginning of the colonial project, colonization that began in earnest in 1490, when Europeans had the ability, they had developed technology to navigate oceans. That process began to destroy indigenous peoples at that time. In fact, in our hemisphere, there was a 96% decline of human beings, indigenous human beings in our hemisphere between 1500 and 1900. Almost everybody died. So colonization, the process, the project of colonization has massively impacted indigenous peoples. And climate justice is indigenous justice because indigenous peoples are the ones that are impacted by every part of colonization, including climate change, which is simply a symptom of colonization. So I do want to say that ecological impact has a disproportionate impact on indigenous communities. So indigenous peoples are the ones who are most impacted first by climate change. And not only do indigenous peoples live in high climate impact zones, but they also tend to be land and water protectors. So it's often indigenous peoples who are the ones that are standing up. This small minority of people that has been nearly decimated, they're standing up for land and water, and they are penalized for that legally, socially, in every way. So not only are our lands and waters contaminated and impacted by this process of colonization, but when we stand up and rise up to protect those things, we are villainized for that. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Sarah. Yes, you made very clear the connections. Climate justice is indigenous justice. Yes. And Manuel, if we could turn to you next. Sarah has made very clear that the roots of our ecological overshoot problem are colonialism and extractive logic. Could you share with us some of the Mayan or broader indigenous ways of relating to the land, and how does that contrast with or critique colonial practices of extraction and exploitation?
Yeah, sure. First of all, thank you very much for allowing me to be in this space to share. As for the question, well, in my own experience, we, the Maya, and along with many other cultures, established the relationship with the land at a very profound level, at a spiritual level. Yeah. So in our worldview, the land is not only a resource to be exploited, but is rather a living entity, right? It's a more than human being, or it is part, it's or relative, akin to a mother figure, right? So from this perspective, the land is respected, is revered as the source of life, sustenance, and connection to the spirit of life. So reverence and respect extend and go beyond mere material sustenance. So reverence and respect permeate into the spiritual realm, where ritual ceremonies and offerings are aimed to honor and to maintain harmony with the land and her spirits. So the spiritual relationship with the land is based on respect, reciprocity, and gratitude. For example, the ritual that we have in the Maya region, known as Hetzlum, involves offering food to re-establish the harmony with the spirit of the earth. So with the Mother Earth, of course. Similarly, other rituals involve seeking permission from the spiritual guardians, protectors of the forest, for example, before starting a crop field, or other rituals offering food in reciprocity while expressing gratitude to the spiritual guardians for allowing people to cultivate and to obtain food in a certain area of the forest, right? And don't get me wrong, this is not to idealize or to romanticize the Maya ceremonies, but rather to acknowledge that such spiritual connections remain relevant and are being reinterpreted by Maya communities in contemporary rituals. So it's not an issue of the past. It's a very present issue. In general terms, indigenous peoples worldwide base their relationship with the earth on respect, reciprocity, and gratitude at spiritual level as well. So for example, if we look at the statements from indigenous delegates at the United Nations from 1977 to present day, we can see that delegates highlight how respect fosters equality with and towards the diverse manifestations of life. So allow me to quote one of the elders, Oren Lyons, who in 1977 spoke before the United Nations, and he mentioned that we have been given principles by which to live mutual respect. So the understanding of creation. So mutual respect here from the perspective of indigenous peoples extend to all living beings, regardless how small or how invisible they might look, right? So in fact, every living being should enjoy the same rights as humans do. Lyons emphasized this in 1977 again. And he states, on behalf of our mother, the earth, and all the great elements, we come here and we say they too have rights. He was referring to the other elements of nature, of Mother Earth. All the living beings inhabiting and being embraced by Mother Earth. So how this contrasts with extractive and exploitative practices? First, I think there is a significant difference in the understanding of what is respect. On the one hand, for indigenous people, respect goes at the spiritual level. And it's not only for Mother Earth, but also for the life that she herself generates, protects, and sustains, right? And that gives rise to a relationship of care based on reciprocity and gratitude, again, at the spiritual level. So for example, if a medicine plant provides us with health of nourishment, we express gratitude. If we take a leaf from such a plant, we acknowledge it to her with gratitude, and we care for her in reciprocity, right? So in contrast, in extractive practices, respect for life has been replaced by domination and exploitation, as Sarah already mentioned, from an anthropocentric stance that does not consider reciprocal care or gratitude at a spiritual level. No? So I would leave it at that, and I hope this is useful.
Yes, thank you so much, Manuel. What wonderful values for us to embrace: respect, reciprocity, and gratitude, and extending that to the land, recognizing the earth as our mother, our relative. Yeah, thank you. Mark, could we turn to you? You are a scholar of history and have done work with the doctrine of discovery. I wonder if you might describe a little bit of that and tell us how the doctrine of discovery continues to influence the relationships among settlers and indigenous peoples and the land in the United States.
Well, thank you so much. It's an honor to be with all of you today. I want to acknowledge I'm in Washington, D.C. My Navajo people would call it Washington. It's the land of the Piscataway, and I want to honor the Piscataway as the host of the land where I'm living. So briefly, the doctrine of discovery, right? What is it? How does it work? The doctrine of discovery, it's a series of papal bulls, edicts of the Catholic Church, written between 1452 and 1493. It says things like invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens and pagans whatsoever, reduce their persons to perpetual slavery, convert them to his and to their use and profit. It's essentially the church in Europe saying to the nations of Europe, wherever you go, whatever land you find not ruled by white European Christian rulers, those people are subhuman and their land is yours to take. So the doctrine of discovery, it's the doctrine that allowed European nations to go into Africa, colonize the continent, and enslave the people because they didn't see them as human. It's the same doctrine that let Columbus, who was literally lost at sea, land in this new world, which was already inhabited by millions, and claim to have discovered it. Right? The first sentence of the first paragraph of the book I co-authored with my good friend Sing-Chan Ra says you cannot discover lands already inhabited. You can conquer those lands, you can steal those lands, you can colonize those lands, but you can't discover them unless the worldview you have informs you that the people already living there are not fully human. So this doctrine of discovery, it impacts us today in really two ways. First of all, it impacts us legally, what we can and cannot do, what's allowed, what's not allowed. Second, it impacts us through the worldview of Western European culture and society, right? And it's the way their worldview is created through this doctrine of discovery. So I want to give you just a few examples. So in 1823, there's a court case. It's between two men of European descent. They're litigating over a single piece of land. One of them got the land from a native tribe. The other one got the same land from the government. They want to know who owned it. The case goes all the way to the Supreme Court. This is the John Marshall Court, 1823, and they had to determine the legal precedent for land titles. Who had the right to sell the land, the native nation or the US government? In their ruling, they determined that it was discovery that gave title to the land. And then because that might almost imply that native peoples who were here first and were there before the Europeans got there, that we might have sovereignty over the land. They went on to say that, but the tribes of Indians who inhabited these lands were fierce savages whose occupation was war and whose subsistence was drawn chiefly from the forest. So it clearly then defines us, native peoples, as savages as compared to the human race of the white people. And so therefore it was concluded that Europeans who were fully human, they had the right of discovery to the land, which gave them the fee title of the land. Well, whereas natives, we were savages and we only had the right of occupancy, right? Like a fish would occupy water, a bird would occupy air. So this is the first time where the doctrine of discovery is referenced in a Supreme Court case determining the legal precedent for land titles. That precedent and the doctrine of discovery are mentioned by name in 1823, first of all, 1954, 1985, and the most recent case was in 2005. I don't have time to go into this case right now, but I'm going to share a link in the chat. It's a TEDx talk I gave called We the People, the 3 most misunderstood words in US history. And I go in depth into that Supreme Court case in 2005. I show how it is probably one of the most white supremacist Supreme Court opinions written in our lifetime, in my lifetime. It references the doctrine of discovery by name, and it makes pretty much the exact same argument that John Marshall made back in 1823. Natives are savages, we've civilized their land, they can't have it back. And that opinion was written in 2005 by Ruth Bader Ginsburg. So this is where it becomes really challenging because now land titles are based on the legal understanding that natives aren't human. Now, again, we have to make a distinction here, because it's not that I'm not seen as a human by the Constitution as a Native man living in Washington, D.C. in 2024, right? That I am. I'm a citizen. I can vote. I can buy and sell land. I can do anything any American can do. But my people, the Navajo Nation, my people are not seen as a sovereign nation with rights to our lands and our reservation lands, because the Navajo Nation cannot technically own land. Our reservation is held for us in trust by the US government. So right now there's a great movement going on of land back, and you can give land back to a Native nation. You can sell your house or sell your church and give the land back, but you actually can't give it back because Native nations don't own the lands. You can put it back into our trust, which is technically owned by the US government, but they're not our lands. They're held in trust for us by the government. So this is where it gets really challenging, because now we're dealing with the foundations of this nation and even the foundations of our capitalistic society. And so I want to just highlight two. I've been accused of being a lawyer a few times, and it's because I like to read Supreme Court cases. But there's two cases I want to just highlight for you very quickly. One was McGirt versus the state of Oklahoma. This was a case decided back in 2020. It basically stated that for judicial purposes, all of Eastern Oklahoma is a reservation. And therefore, if a Native person commits a crime on those lands against another Native person, the jurisdiction for that crime falls to the federal courts. So it stated all of Eastern of Oklahoma was a reservation. Now, in that ruling written by Neil Gorsuch, who's one of the best minds on the US Supreme Court right now, and he was an appointee, and I'm going to say appointee, and if you don't agree with me, that's fine, but he was an appointee of President Trump. But because he served in the Rocky Mountain area in Colorado on the federal courts there, he actually has a lot of experience with Native history and Native cases. And so he is really the best mind on the court right now for Native issues. And he wrote the McGirt opinion. And he basically said, yes, for judicial purposes, all of Eastern Oklahoma is a reservation. The state doesn't have the right to break a treaty, and the courts don't have a right to break a treaty, so therefore it's a reservation. But then he explicitly says, if you want to break a treaty with the Native nations, you just have to go to Congress. And anytime Congress can muster the will, all they have to do is state their intent, and they can break a treaty whenever they want, and there will be no consequence. So Neil Gorsuch clearly said to McGirt and to the Choctaw Nation, you've won this battle, but there is no way you're winning this war because you have no sovereignty in front of Congress. Now, it's fascinating because just last summer, there was another court case, Arizona versus the Navajo Nation, where my people were suing the state of Arizona and asking the federal government to reassess our treaty rights for the water coming out of the Colorado River. We weren't claiming it. We didn't say we needed to have it. We said, please just reassess it. We asked again and again and again. And finally went to the court last summer, and the majority opinion ruled against us. It was written by Brett Kavanaugh, another Trump appointee to the Supreme Court. And he basically said, yeah, you don't get to have your rights reassessed. Now, Neil Gorsuch wrote the minority opinion. And if you ever want to watch one justice take another justice to school, read this opinion, because Neil Gorsuch absolutely takes Brett Kavanaugh and the entire conservative justices absolutely to school. Goes through Native history, goes through Navajo history, talks about the Long Walk, talks about all the things that have been done to us, all the horrible atrocities that took place, absolutely takes them to school. And even says, we need to honor this treaty because treaties are the supreme law of the land. Now, that's the phrase that every Native person is begging the federal government to honor. Treaties are the supreme law of the land. The Constitution states that in the Supremacy Clause. Why did Neil Gorsuch say that in writing the minority opinion, but not say it when writing the majority opinion? Because the majority opinion becomes case law. It becomes law. It's case law. The minority is merely stating your opposition. It's food for fodder, but it does not create law or case law or precedent. And so Neil Gorsuch, when he's writing his opinion, he says, yes, we have to honor treaties because they're supreme law of the land. When he's writing case law, he says in front of the US Congress, natives have no rights. And this is the challenge that we face, which is to this day, this doctrine of discovery and the understanding that natives as nations are not human, they are not peers, they are not sovereign over their land, they are in every way subject to the United States or their colonial governments. And that's the problem we're facing, not just here in the US, but around the world.
Thank you so much, Mark, for laying that out so clearly. The historical and current injustices, as well as the legal and worldview foundations of this doctrine of discovery that needs to be dismantled. So I'd like to turn now, if we can, from the challenges, these hard realities that we lament, and look toward what is the path for justice and healing. And I want to direct the next question to Manuel and Mark. How do you envision the path of healing for Indigenous peoples and for our climate? And could we start with Manuel, please?
Yes, yes, sure. Well, it's a very, very difficult question. It has many alternatives, I would say. But I personally think that one of the paths of healing for Indigenous peoples and for our mother, for the Mother Earth, starts with moving beyond the anthropocentric paradigm, meaning that we should consider Mother Earth and the rest of the living creatures equals and enjoying the same rights. So there is already a human rights approach while seeking justice for Indigenous peoples, right? And I believe that such an approach must encompass as well an approach based on, again, respect, reciprocity, and gratitude to Mother Earth at that level, at the spiritual level. And in terms of international law, I think that the implementation of the rights of Indigenous peoples as enshrined in the UNDRIP or United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is very crucial. It's a first step towards healing for both Indigenous peoples and again, for Mother Earth. Also expanding the legal protection and rights to the other species and the ecosystems will allow us to shift towards a more sustainable and harmonious relationship with Mother Earth. So I believe that by embracing this, a more profound and reciprocal relationship with the land and the spirits of life, the notion of justice will take on new meanings. So I believe that respect and justice must be sustained by the voice of the spirit, that is, from the spirituality of each and every one of us. Justice can be mobilized in a more meaningful way, I believe. So furthermore, addressing climate crisis requires first acknowledging the role of Indigenous peoples as stewards of the land. Second, to allow them to lead the healing of Mother Earth and see practicing justice from Indigenous perspectives. And for this, the third example, third point, I'm going to give you an example. There are already some of them taking place all over the world, but just to mention one, for example, the jurist Belkis Izquierdo, a Colombian first Indigenous magistrate, is advocating to recognize, or for the recognition of the territory as a victim who is injured in conflicts, war, for example, right? So such recognition at a legal level could mean that Mother Earth, the territory, could file a lawsuit to demand reparations to her perpetrators. And that is very interesting and a very innovative way to practice Indigenous justice, right? So it's one example. I think it can show us some of the alternatives to the path of healing of Indigenous peoples in Mother Earth.
Thank you, Manuel, for lifting up again those spiritual roots as well as legal means for bringing about justice and healing. Mark, would you like to respond as well, how you envision the path of healing and justice for Indigenous peoples and our climate?
Yes, thank you. I'd like to tell two short stories here. The first story, and let me just grab my notes to make sure I'm not misspeaking here. The first story, right, let's look back at how the US has tried to address this path of healing. We all know that the US government stole the Black Hills from the Dakota people. And then they carved some of their faces of their most genocidal presidents into the side of those hills. Later, they felt bad about it. And so they went back to the Lakota and said, we'd like to buy these hills from you. We'd like to pay you for the hills. And the Lakota said, they're not for sale. They went back to us, but you can't buy them from us. To this day, there was $1 billion sitting in a trust fund the Lakota refused to touch because they told the US government, you cannot buy the Black Hills from us. What's the lesson there? We can't sell out. As Native peoples, we cannot sell our birthright. We cannot sell out to this system of capitalism and allow our colonizers to pay a fine for their ethnic cleansing and genocidal practices. We can't sell out to them. The second story I'd like to tell is about a man I met. And he was a leader at a school. He's a principal at a school. And we were talking, he was Native. I forget what tribe he was from, but he was Native. And he was telling me a story about his father. And he said someone came to his father, who is a Native elder, and said, what do you think of the fact that your land is now filled with non-Native peoples? And this elder looked and said, well, they'll leave. What do you mean they'll leave? They've been here for hundreds of years. They've built cities. They've built all this infrastructure. What do you mean they'll leave? He said, well, when the land is no longer profitable for them, they'll leave. They'll go run somewhere else. And then we, the Indigenous peoples, will nurse our land back to health. It's fascinating today, right? That the billionaires. Elon Musk is intent on colonizing Mars. The billionaires are having a space race to get to the moon and beyond, right? They're already looking to where else can we colonize? Where else can we go and exploit and mine for resources and make uninhabitable? And they're going to leave. They're leaving is probably the best way to put it. And this is why it's so important for us not to sell out. It's so important to remain true to the teachings we receive, the things we know, the things we understand, the histories, the culture, the practices we've been giving. We have to hold on to these. Because someone is going to need to nurse our land back to health. And all the capitalists are going to leave. They're leaving. And then we can step forward as the grandmother who's been, if you've heard my metaphor, the grandmother in the house, right? The grandmother who owns the house. And we can help those who are left behind and our people nurse our lands back to health. And so this is where we can't just become capitalists. We can't just take on the values and the ways of our colonizers. We must continue to remember who we are, what we've been taught, and what we need to do. And then we also need to be patient. Continue fighting like we've been fighting, but understanding, yeah, they are going to chase their profits around the galaxy as their technology enables them to. And so we have to maintain our own understanding, our own worldview, and we have to remain true to who we are so that we can be a part of healing our land back when we're able to. And that's just, I mean, I have so many other solutions I've laid out there. We need a national dialogue on race, gender, and class. We need a Truth and Conciliation Commission, right? We need a lot of things, but I wanted to give you a bigger picture here of things that we need to do. And I would say what we need to do, we need to not sell out, and we need to play the long game.
Thank you, Mark. Yeah, for those reminders and for that image of nursing the land back to health led by our Indigenous elders. That is a beautiful image. Thank you. And I think what you're saying about not selling out to capitalism and being in there for the long haul also resonates with what I have heard from Sarah and Sherry and your call to decolonize. So yes, thank you. I hear a lot of resonance. I'd like to pose one more question and open it to any of our panelists before we move on to some of the questions that were submitted by our webinar participants today. And this is just the question of what can we, people of faith, we're here in a webinar of people from Mennonite Church USA. What can we as people of faith in communities of faith, how can we participate in deep systemic change, the kind of change I hear you all calling us to? How can we do that? How can we help to break patterns of extraction and exploitation in ways that honor Indigenous lifeways? So it's a big question. I open it to any of you who would like to respond. Yes, go ahead, Sarah.
Yeah, so the first thing I want to touch on is we have to reject this idea that our primary identity is as consumers. We are not consumers. We are divine beings made in the image of the divine. The idea that we can recycle our way out of climate change is a fallacy. Fallacy is a big fancy word for, misunderstanding, a lie, something that will never work. There is no individual action that we can take beyond committing our lives to working collectively. And this is what I mean by that. As a church, our institutional church, that institution that represents us, has a moral obligation to stand with land and water protectors in the world. If we're not doing that publicly, loudly, reaching out to decision makers in this world, if we are not saying enough is enough, then how can we call ourselves moral authorities? It is our obligation to stand with those people, the most vulnerable, Indigenous peoples, who are the ones standing up for land and water. We have the opportunity to do that. We must do that. As Sherry was describing earlier, we're standing on the brink to global disaster. You don't have to believe that climate change is real to acknowledge the ecological overshoot across 9 dimensions is happening. We are absolutely on the brink of collapse. Will the church stand up with the rational people who are standing for life, land, and water protectors, standing with and embodying the spirit of life? Or will the church behave like cowardly lions and say, we can't do that because it's too costly to us politically, it's too costly to us socially? Speaking for myself, speaking for the Coalition to Dismantle the Doctrine of Discovery, we will stand with Indigenous land and water protectors as loudly and publicly as we possibly can. We will stand with the vulnerable. And I have this question to all of the Christian churches of Earth. Where are you? Where are you?
Thank you, Sarah, for that very clear call to stand with land and water protectors. Yes. Others, would you like to respond? How can we participate in breaking patterns, deep systemic change? Go ahead, Manuel.
Well, thank you. Just quickly, I would like to take on the points that Shara was mentioning. When we speak to our communities, be it religious or be it indigenous, for example, it is very important to share data, to share information, as Sherry was doing before, as Sarah was mentioning as well. It is really, really important to show the data, to show how much and to what extent the water is polluted by chemical products, how this water is being consumed by a number of people at the community level, and what is the consequence in the people's health, how this is affecting the health of indigenous peoples and other communities. And so I think, well, regarding the question on how to start making structural changes, I have witnessed that structural changes start from bottom up, meaning that it is when communities, when indigenous people or other social groups organize themselves and organize ourselves, and then push our proposals, our ideas to the institutions, right? And I have seen important changes in these regards. So I think that if we are willing to share, for example, the feeling, the sacredness of life from indigenous point of view to a wider community, or to share it in a religious community, or in an academic community, and in combination with information, with data that can collectively lead us to rethink the way we are behaving with Mother Earth, right? Might help. I think I am really convinced of this. And I want to quickly mention that I am glad to be part of a working group together with the Coalition on Dismantling the Doctrine of Discovery and the Maya communities. And it's already several years now that we started a collaboration thinking of bringing all this conversation, data, and feeling to other communities, widening the conversation, right? And involving also other communities that in principle will disagree or would disagree with us, but making them part of the conversation makes sense, because I think we need to be seated at the same table and listen to other and share what we feel, and also try to feel what the others feel, right? And in terms of environment, in terms of health, the pollution of water in the Maya region is affecting everyone. It's affecting also other Mennonite colonies that we are approaching right now. So why we should not gather together and find common solutions? So I think that would be a way to start changing the system.
Thank you, Manuel. Mark or Sherry, would you like to respond before we turn to our questions that have been submitted?
I feel like what's been said has already shared everything I have to share, but Mark, please go.
Mark, we lost your audio, buddy.
Sorry, yes, here I am. A few things I'd like to say. The first is one of the biggest things to move towards systemic change is through the process of building relationships. And I know this has been shared before, and people who know the coalition have probably seen this before, but there's a site I use frequently called native-land.ca. And on this website, you can begin your research for whose land are you on? Who's indigenous to the land where your house lives, where your business is, where your church is, where you're traveling to. It's not the final authority, but it's a great place to begin your research. And I encourage people to begin the process of building a relationship with the people whose land you're living on. Now, this is going to require you going out of your way, going across the country, maybe somewhere else to meet them, because most likely they've been moved. Or you're going to have to look around the margins and the fringes of your society to find them. And I encourage people not to build this relationship through your role as an institution. If you're a pastor or an elder and you want to say, I'm going to lead my way into this as I'm going to go build this on behalf of my institution, don't do that. Why? Because you're not in that role permanently. And when you move on to another role, that relationship's going to die. And so that leaves us as Indigenous peoples building a relationship over and over and over again with people who step into these new roles. And so build the relationship as an individual, as someone who is trying to live with personal integrity, and then through that, invite your institution and expose your institution to those relationships. But don't build the relationship because of your role within the institution. Build it personally, and don't build it to learn or to study us, but build it to build a real relationship that gets messy. And it's out of the messiness where the solutions begin to come. So that's the first thing I would recommend. Second, I want to talk briefly, Sarah said something, we're not going to recycle our way out of this problem, right? The United States of America, we're about 1/20th of the world's population, and we consume more than 1/4 of the world's resources. Right? If every global citizen consumed like the average American, we would be out of renewable services or resources by April, by now. The American lifestyle is not sustainable. It requires oppression. It requires uninhabitable practices. So if we're going to change anything, it's not just about recycling more. It's also about consuming less. We have to learn how to live by consuming less. And we need to do that both individually as well as institutionally and even corporately. And so I really want to encourage people, as you're looking at what can we do, don't just start by recycling everything that you already consume. Learn how to consume less. And that's a very important thing. I also want to just share very briefly, and then I'm done. For people who want to know more about the work that I'm doing, I am the author of a book called Unsettling Truths, and there is a way that you can buy a copy of my book from my website. I also have, you can buy a 10-book pack. It's a book study special. And if you buy a 10-book pack, I will send you 10 signed copies of the book and give your book study a virtual Q&A with my book. And I'll do a Q&A with you on there. So I love the conversations we're starting here. I'm so grateful to be a part of this. And yeah, this is a really good dialogue.
Thank you so very much for those really concrete suggestions that you have each offered. Lorraine, it's 1 minute till 2, but we have some really good questions that have been submitted. What surfaces, what rises to the top that we could ask a few of these questions that have been submitted?
Yeah, as I'm looking through them, I know obviously we're going to have additional webinars, and I think some of the questions that have been asked will likely be talked about in subsequent seminars that we're having that Carla will talk about. And Mark, maybe you answered this question that someone just put into the chat, was asking about how to connect with local land water protectors to stand in solidarity. I thought this might be also a good time to put in a plug, not only to do the work locally, but also for the Coalition to Dismantle the Doctrine of Discovery. If you want to talk a little bit about your website and how that can connect to this question.
A really easy way to connect with local land and water protectors is to look in your newspaper and see where stuff is happening. You can, most states at the legislative level, there's a bill tracker where you can see, what bills are in play. You can track legislation and where tribes are weighing in, not only tribal entities, but also tribal community groups. That's a good way. But if you want to work collectively, which we very much strongly advocate for, because we know that all the systems that we were each born into were created collectively. There is no reality on this earth that's created by individuals. It's all created collectively. If you would like to work towards collective solutions, please join us in the Coalition to Dismantle the Doctrine of Discovery. You don't need to have any special skills or resources to do that. We want you. We need you. We believe that by spending our lives, living our lives together in this struggle, we can collaborate with the Spirit of life, the Holy Spirit that is working for transformation in this world. Our coalition is not a coalition of organizations, it's a coalition of ordinary people. We are represented in Canada, the United States, and Mexico, all across North America. And we are working together using the life energy that we have across this nation. Our web address is dismantlediscovery.org. We have public meetings every single month. We'd love to see you at one. We have an orientation the third Thursday of every month. If you go to our website, there is a calendar, and you can click on the calendar to register for orientation. We also have a coffee hour once a month where you can come and talk about whatever you want to, and we'll get you connected with a working group. Or you can come to our Prayer is Action Hour. That is on one Friday a month. Typically, it's the last Friday of every month. You can sign on just through our calendar. You can come to our website and sign up for a newsletter. Truly, we want you. We need you. We are envisioning a world together that doesn't yet exist, and we call that world the Kingdom of God. Join us. We want you.
Thank you. I can't think of a better way to think through that question and other questions that others may have than to go on that website and join with you. So thank you so much. Carla, just looking at the time, I know you have a few closing comments. I think that these are questions that we can hold on to and know that we will be addressing them at some point and ensuring that we do with panelists that we have in subsequent webinars. So I think that's okay to do.
Okay, thank you. And certainly we hope that this is not a final conversation, that many more conversations and questions will be generated from this gathering here today. I am so full of gratitude to you, our panelists, Mark, Manuel, Sarah, and Sherry. Thank you so much for the wisdom that you have shared with us today. Just naming some challenging truths, but also offering us hope that there is a path for transformation and that there are ways that we can work together for healing and justice for our earth, and for all who dwell in it together. So just thank you so much. And thank you to all of our participants who have been watching, and I hope that, yes, that these conversations will continue. Want to let everyone know that you can continue to receive updates and more news from Mennonite Church USA and our Climate Justice Ministry through Piecemeal, Mennonite Church USA's weekly e-newsletter. You can subscribe to that. And we hope that you will join us for our next webinar in our Climate Justice Seeking Shalom series. That webinar is entitled Love God, Love Your Neighbor, Love Yourself, Spiritual Practices That Nurture Life. That will be held on April 15 at 2 p.m. Eastern Time with panelists Sarah Werner, Sibonokule Nakube, and Andrew Hudson. And if you've appreciated our webinar today and would like to support the Climate Justice Ministry of Mennonite Church USA, please consider a gift of financial support. You can make donations designated for the Climate Justice Ministry on Mennonite Church USA's giving page. We thank you so much for your support. And again, many thanks to all of you, our panelists and participants, for participating today. May the Spirit of our Creator God grant us courage and power and joy as we together seek shalom for all our kindred on planet Earth. Goodbye.